Hello, church. We're so glad that you're going to be joining us for this study. It's called Rise Up, and we're going to be looking through 1st and 2nd Samuel at the life of some of the first kings of Israel and where they succeeded, where they failed, and what we can learn about our relationship with God today from this text. Before we jump into the scripture, it's really important to understand the historical context of when this is taking place. The point of the story that we're at in the Old Testament when this book is being written. So, we're coming out of a period known as Judges. God has chosen Israel as his people. He's promised to make them into a great nation. He's promised to give them their land. He's delivered them out of slavery in Egypt, and he's proven that he is their God. He takes them into the promised land, and he removes all the people who were living there one by one. He proves that he is going to fulfill his promise. And God does all of this without the help of a human king. Israel has no monarchy. They have no leader that is born into this position. God is using these people known as judges. And every now and then, one of them is risen up. God chooses one person to be kind of the spokesperson for him, of his people. And they fall into this pattern of behavior where Israel sins, they disobey, they turn away from God, they start worshiping other gods. As a result of their sin, God allows consequences to happen. He allows their enemies to prevail over them. And so they fall under captivity or attack or duress, and they cry out to God and say, "We're so sorry, please forgive us." And he chooses to forgive them, and he sends a judge to lead them out of that oppression and back into prosperity. And yet the cycle continues over and over and over again. Finally, this cycle ends in the book of Judges with Samson, who his personal story kind of epitomizes this cycle of prosperity and unfaithfulness and desperation. And so Israel is now in this period where they're not hearing from God. They have no judges, and they're just kind of lost. They're rudderless. They're like a ship without a captain. And so they cry out to God, and no one is really hearing from him. Even their own priests, as we'll see, have turned away from God. And so it's in this context that this woman, Hannah, goes to pray before God. She goes to offer sacrifices and worship the Lord. And she has one desire. Not for all of Israel to be saved, not for her son to be a great king or judge or anything like that. She just wants to have a kid. You see, she's part of this marriage to this man who also has another wife. And the other woman is able to have many kids, and so this becomes kind of a source of conflict between the three of them. The other wife is constantly taunting Hannah because Hannah cannot have children. And it doesn't matter how faithful Hannah is, it doesn't matter how hard she tries, it doesn't matter what she does, she cannot make this happen, and so she feels ashamed. And this is where our story starts in 1 Samuel. This first chapter of 1 Samuel sees Hannah going into the house of the Lord and praying that God will give her a child. And she's actually praying so desperately, and she's moving her mouth so furiously as she's silently praying before the Lord, that the priest comes and says, "What are you doing here, woman? Why are you drunk before God?" And she says, "I'm not drunk. I'm just so passionate about this. I'm just so desperate for the Lord to hear my prayer." And so the prophet looks at her and he says, "It's going to happen." The priest tells her, "Go home. God is going to answer your prayer." And so she goes home. And then this happens. This is 1 Samuel 1, starting in verse 19. Early the next morning they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah, the man that she's married to, made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." And Hannah makes this promise that she's going to give Samuel back to the Lord. And so that's where this chapter goes, is that as soon as she weans him, as soon as he's able to function without her, she drops him off back at the house of the Lord and says, "You belong to God." And this is kind of an odd way to start this story. This is kind of a strange place for this very epic monarchy, Game of Thrones style struggle for power that we're going to see throughout the rest of these books. But it starts with a very important concept. The timing is God's. It doesn't matter how bad Hannah wants it. It doesn't matter what effort she's willing to put in. It doesn't matter how faithful she is. It doesn't matter any of that, because it's God's timing. You see, Samuel is going to become a prophet before God. He's going to supplant the current priest in his lineage who have been unfaithful to God, and God's going to replace them with Samuel, and Samuel is going to anoint the first king of Israel. And if Hannah had had it in her timing, if she had had her son when she first wanted, he wouldn't have been the right age. He wouldn't have been in the right position. He would have been forgotten to time and history. But because it was God's timing, not Hannah's, we're still talking about this prophet Samuel thousands of years later. He made an impact that will ripple through the rest of eternity. And this is a lesson that Israel is going to learn soon. They're going to demand a king in a couple chapters, but it's going to be on their timing. They're going to want what they want, even though it's not God's design for them. And it's not until God's true king gets in position, first in David and ultimately in Jesus, that everything comes together. And so, church, as we go through this difficult season of life, this year that hasn't gone the way any of us have thought it would or wanted it to, remember that it's all about God's timing, not ours. Hannah, you can clearly see in this first chapter, felt like something was wrong with her. She allowed her enemy to taunt her. She allowed it to get inside and beat herself up. But she wasn't doing something wrong. She wasn't being punished. She was waiting in God's timing. And so, for us today, we got to take that step back and look at our circumstance, look at our situation, look at that thing that we are trying so hard to make happen, that thing that we think if we just pray hard enough, it'll happen. If I'm just good enough, it'll happen. If I just be obedient to everything God says, then definitely that'll make it happen. And when it doesn't happen, we beat ourselves up and we question, what did I do wrong? Why wasn't I good enough? Why doesn't God hear me? We got to take a step back and look at God's timing. Because as we see here in 1 Samuel chapter 1, if it happens in our timing, it might be good. But if it happens in God's timing, it's going to be something special.